This stray dog walked 10 miles every day. The truth will break your heart. I was standing at the old bus stop on Avenue when I first caught a glimpse of the dog. It was early morning, before the sun had fully risen, and an icy wind whispered through the dimly lit streets. The dog appeared as nothing more than a shadow skirting the edge of the sidewalk, limping ever so slightly, head bowed low, but moving with a strange sense of purpose. I was about to board the bus for my daily commute, but something about the dog's silhouette against the waning moonlight made my heart clench. I couldn't explain it, just a sharp twist in my gut that told me I needed to pay attention, as if I was seeing something I wasn't meant to see. The dog's form was lean, ribs etched clearly beneath a dirty coat, but there was a quiet determination in its posture that betrayed a deeper story. A story of heartbreak, longing, or maybe both. I boarded the bus, still watching through the smudged windows as the dog continued down the sidewalk. It disappeared behind a corner, and the bus pulled away, leaving me wondering why I felt so uneasy. Something about its stride, the way it moved like it was following a well-worn path, haunted me throughout the day. I tried to push the thought away. After all, there were countless strays in the city, all with stories we rarely take time to hear. But that same evening, when I stepped off my bus at the station near my apartment, I spotted that same ragged form again, limping across the road. It was clearly tired, muzzle dipped in exhaustion, but it kept going as though pulled by an invisible thread, some desperate mission etched into its very bones. That night I could barely sleep. My dreams were filled with the sound of lonely paw steps echoing on deserted streets. In these strange, half-waking visions, I saw the dog traveling across busy roads, weaving around speeding cars, forging ahead under driving rain. I saw it struggling through neighborhoods where porch lights flickered like beacons in the gloom, but never stopping, never seeking shelter. By the time I woke up, drenched in sweat and tangled in my sheets, I had resolved to learn more about this mysterious traveler. There was an urgency in me that I couldn't quite explain, a sense that something monumental was happening right under our noses, something so simple yet profound that we'd all failed to notice. I decided I would keep an eye out and follow, if it allowed me. Early the next morning, I caught sight of the dog again near the same bus stop. It must have left somewhere before dawn, continuing this trek that I was starting to suspect happened daily, possibly for miles on end. The dog was trembling with hunger or cold, maybe both, but its pace was steady. I approached cautiously, my breath making clouds in the chilly air. Close up, I noticed one of its ears was torn, the fur around its paws caked with mud. The dog paused when it sensed me near, turning weary eyes toward me. I raised my hand slightly, trying to show I wasn't a threat. For a fleeting moment, our gazes locked. I could see fear, but also resolve, something so heartbreaking in its depth that it made my chest tighten painfully. Then, as if remembering it had somewhere it desperately needed to be, the dog lowered its head and continued onward. I ditched my usual bus ride that morning. My curiosity burned too fiercely to ignore. I walked behind the dog from a distance, watching it navigate alleyways and side streets, sniffing around curbs as though searching for something. It paused occasionally to drink from puddles or to sniff at empty fast food wrappers, but otherwise kept a surprisingly brisk pace. I checked my phone and realized we'd covered more than 2 miles in less than an hour, weaving through various parts of town I rarely visited. As the dog walked, it seemed to know exactly where it was going. There were no wasted steps, no aimless wandering. Everything it did was methodical, almost ritualistic. The city's bustle swelled around us. Cars honking, people rushing to work, the smell of coffee and bagels drifting from corner shops. Yet the dog moved on, detached from the human world that barely noticed it. I found myself straining to keep up, my legs already protesting. Eventually, I watched it stop in front of a small rundown house with peeling paint on the porch railings. A broken chain-link fence and a yard overrun with weeds surrounded the property. It was the kind of place people ignored on their hurried way to somewhere else. The dog approached the front steps but did not climb them. Instead, it settled onto its hind legs and waited, gazing at the door in quiet anticipation. Every minute or so, it would let out a low whine, a sound that resonated with such heartbreak that I had to look away. Several long minutes passed, the dog unwavering in its vigil. Finally, with a shiver, it rose and nudged the door with its nose. There was no answer, no movement inside. The windows were all shuttered, the mailbox overflowing with old letters. After another eternity of waiting, the dog slowly limped away, head hung low, shoulders sagging. Whatever it had hoped to find in that empty house, whoever it was waiting for, was not there to greet it. For a moment, I wondered if perhaps the dog had once lived there, and its owners had moved or passed away, leaving it behind. That possibility sent a deep ache through my chest. There is a unique cruelty in animals being abandoned by the people they trust most. Yet something told me this was more than just a stray returning to an old home. The sense of purpose I'd witnessed all morning hinted at something deeper, something that wouldn't let the dog give up. So, when it left that house and continued walking, I followed. Over the next few hours, I tracked it through a complex route that took us far from my comfortable part of town. We crossed busy intersections, where the dog narrowly avoided being struck by speeding cars multiple times. We passed through industrial zones where the air smelled of machinery and hot metal. Eventually, to my astonishment, we reached a neighborhood more upscale than where I lived. Tall fences, manicured lawns, polished cars in driveways. It felt incongruous to see this battered, half-starved creature walking these pristine sidewalks, as if it belonged there, ignoring the suspicious glances of joggers and dog walkers passing with their well-groomed pets. Finally, we arrived at a large, elegant house painted a cheery yellow, complete with a wraparound porch lined by flowering plants. I held my breath as the dog approached a tall oak tree in the yard. It circled the trunk carefully, limping on one back leg that seemed especially painful now. Then it sat in the grass, gazing up at the house's windows. The curtains were drawn, and it was difficult to tell if anyone was inside. I stood at a distance, my feet aching from the unexpected journey, and watched. The dog seemed to be waiting for something once more. Unlike the smaller house we'd visited earlier, this one looked like it was occupied. Maybe the dog was hoping to see a friendly face or reconnect with someone who used to live there. But no one came to the door or looked out the window. After some time, the dog rose and limped away again. At this point, my mind was reeling. We traveled miles, at least 10 by now, weaving through vastly different parts of the city. The dog moved as if it had a map etched into its very soul, visiting spots that felt important or meaningful. Each time it arrived at a destination, it paused, waited, and left, as though it were performing a solemn ritual of mourning or memory. It was like watching a pilgrim visiting sacred shrines, paying silent homage to moments long gone. I decided then that I would keep following this dog for as many days as necessary to understand its secret. There had to be a reason for this grueling journey. No living creature would endure such hardship on a daily basis without a powerful force driving it. So the next morning, I came prepared. I wore comfortable shoes, packed a backpack with water and snacks, and even brought along a small container of dog food in case I could earn its trust. Once again, I found the dog near Avenue, starting its pilgrimage in the dim pre-dawn light. And once again, I followed. Over the next several days, I documented its movements. The dog would begin pass an abandoned lot, then pause at the first rundown house. It always waits there for a long spell, then moves on. Eventually, it would visit the large yellow house in the affluent neighborhood, circle under the oak tree, then continue onward to other seemingly random points across town. Sometimes it would stop by the river that cut through the industrial district, sniffing at the water's edge. Other times it paused by a dusty corner store that rarely had customers. Each stop was visited in the same pattern, as though it had a strict timetable to keep. But the most heart-wrenching part was that, despite how far the dog walked, it never seemed to find what it was searching for. Every evening, near sundown, I would see it collapse into a ragged bed of cardboard behind an old warehouse. That appeared to be its resting place, a pitiful nest that offered little warmth against the dropping temperatures. Then, with each new dawn, it was up again, repeating the same solemn journey. I watched as the dog's condition worsened over time. Its limp became more pronounced, ribs more visible beneath its thinning coat. A persistent cough emerged whenever it lay down, raspy and wet. Yet nothing stopped it from rising each day and following the same route over and over again. I became determined to help. At first, I tried to offer it water and dog food during its journey. The dog would accept the water occasionally, licking at it with obvious desperation. But it rarely touched the food, as though it had no time or appetite for a meal. Once I reached out to gently pet its head. The dog tensed, but then allowed my touch for a brief moment, quivering under my hand. I almost thought it would remain with me then, maybe let me carry it to a shelter or a vet, but a second later, something seemed to remind it of its mission. It pulled away, eyes flickering with that same heartbreak and determination, and continued on its path. I was left there, feeling a surge of helplessness and a tear threatening to escape the corner of my eye. Eventually, word began to spread around the neighborhood about a stray dog wandering all over town. Locals started to recognize me as the one following the limping dog. A few people asked me questions or offered vague stories. I think that dog used to belong to the old man who lived in that house. Or wasn't there a tragedy that happened on the other side of town involving a dog and a family? But no one had concrete information. Everyone seemed equally baffled and moved by the dog's daily odyssey. Determined to learn the truth, I started knocking on doors of the houses the dog visited. The first few attempts yielded no answers. The rundown house with peeling paint was abandoned. The mailbox stuffed with letters belonged to someone named Martin, but no one knew where he'd gone. At the elegant yellow house, an elderly caretaker answered the door. She seemed startled when I asked about the stray dog, her eyes brimming with sadness. "Yes, I've seen him," she murmured, glancing past me toward the oak tree. "He comes by every morning, sits under that tree for a while. I've tried to lure him with treats, but he never stays." I asked if the dog belonged to someone at that address. The caretaker hesitated, then shook her head. "Not that I know of. The family who owns this place travels often. They're hardly ever here. But I do recall a time, maybe a year ago, when I saw a young woman visiting. She had a dog with a similar coat color, though in much better shape. Could it be the same one? She used to sit under that oak tree and read while the dog played in the yard. Then, one day, she just stopped coming. I never learned why. Sometimes I think the dog is waiting for her." My heart ached at the thought of the dog waiting for someone who might never return. Still, I had more questions than answers. As the days wore on, I became obsessed. Every free hour I had went into researching or following the dog. I scoured local social media groups, posted pictures of the dog, hoping someone could identify it. I asked veterinarians if they recognized the limping dog with the torn ear. I even combed through old newspaper archives. My determination paid off in small pieces of information that gradually formed a mosaic of sorrow. From a thread in a local community group, I discovered someone who claimed to have seen the dog walking in the direction of a hospital downtown. Intrigued, I followed that lead and found that, indeed, the dog would occasionally make a detour to the hospital's side entrance. There it would wait, nose pressed against the glass door, as if expecting someone to step out. Hospital security eventually shooed it away each time, but the dog never lingered long. This peculiar clue suggested maybe it had once accompanied a patient or visited someone ill. Slowly, I pieced together more details. The dog's name, it seemed, was rumored to be. An old man at a bus stop recognized the photograph I showed him on my phone. He said his granddaughter had once played with a friendly brown dog named that belonged to a young couple living near the river. That same man recalled a tragedy. The young woman of that couple had been in a severe car accident and never returned from the hospital. The man's voice wavered as he relayed this half-remembered tale, and I felt my stomach drop. Could it be that was waiting for that woman? Or had she once been waiting for someone else from that same home, maybe the man? When I took this question to the caretaker at the yellow house, she grew teary-eyed and admitted she remembered hearing about a terrible wreck that claimed several lives, including that of a promising young woman. The caretaker wasn't sure of the woman's name, but she recalled a photo she once found near the oak tree of a bright-faced couple smiling next to a dog that looked suspiciously like. I thought to keep it safe, but the photo vanished a few days later, she confessed. Maybe the wind carried it off, or maybe that dog took it, I can't say. With every new piece of the puzzle, my heart grew heavier, as though I was slowly realizing that this epic journey made each day was a pilgrimage of grief. The dog was retracing the footprints of a life that had vanished. It visited the old rundown house, possibly once belonging to the woman's parents, now empty. It visited the yellow house, where the woman herself had lived or often spent time. Then it moved on to the hospital, where maybe she'd spent her final days. And somewhere in between, it visited all those other spots: a corner store where she might have bought snacks, a riverbank where she loved to read, or an industrial zone where a relative worked. The city was a labyrinth of memories, each stop a memorial shrine to the person she lost. The magnitude of it overwhelmed me. Most dogs, when abandoned or left behind, might wander aimlessly or try to find a new home, but was doing something else entirely. She was clinging to the life she once had with a devotion so fierce it refused to let go. The sadness of it was almost unbearable. And yet within that sadness there was a grandeur, a testament to the bond between humans and animals that we seldom understand in its fullness. Was teaching me something about loyalty, love, and the painful echo of absence. The more I discovered, the more determined I became to intervene and help. Surely there had to be a better fate for than wandering these streets, starving and injured, reliving heartbreak day after day. I visited the local animal shelter, explained the situation, and asked for advice. They recommended setting humane traps, providing the dog with medical care, and then trying to find it a new home. But the thought of removing from her pilgrimage filled me with guilt. What if this daily journey was all she had left, her only thread connecting her to the person she'd lost? Still, the reality was grim. Winter was fast approaching, and its condition was declining. If left alone, she might not survive the coming cold snaps, the snow, and the icy winds. Every time I saw her struggle to rise from her makeshift bed or heard her barking cough, I felt a stab of urgency. Even if I couldn't bring back the person missed, I could at least give her a chance at a better life. And maybe, in time, help her heal. Catching was no easy task. The shelter provided me with a humane trap, large enough for a medium-sized dog, complete with enticing food. Each night, I would place it near her usual sleeping spot behind the warehouse. Sometimes I'd watch from a distance, heart pounding as approached, sniffing warily. But the moment she realized it was a trap, she'd dart away. Her trust in humans was so fragile that one wrong move sent her running. I changed tactics. I spent my evenings quietly sitting nearby, offering food without the trap in sight, letting her grow used to my presence. I whispered soothing words, refusing to make any sudden movements. Slowly, day by day, she began to let me sit closer. One night she actually finished the entire bowl of dog food I'd set out, though she trembled the entire time. My heart soared at this small triumph, and I dared to hope. But the real breakthrough came one evening when a biting wind cut through the alley and struggled to stand. Her limp had grown worse, and a fresh wound on her back leg leaked blood. I could see she was shivering violently. Softly, I approached with a thick blanket in hand. She tried to back away, but her pain must have been overwhelming. Eventually, she let me drape the blanket over her. I sat there, tears brimming in my eyes, murmuring that it would be all right, that I would help her. She rested her weary head on her paws, still trembling, eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something resembling gratitude. Over the following week, my presence in her nightly routine became normal to her. She seemed more willing to meet my gaze, and one morning, I made the decision to try leading her to a safer place. Armed with a soft leash and a pocket full of treats, I approached her gently. At first, she resisted, panic flaring in her eyes. She backed away, almost knocking over a stack of old crates, her entire body tense. I knelt down, carefully avoiding sudden moves, and set the leash on the ground between us. Slowly, with a trembling hand, I offered a piece of cooked chicken from my pocket. The scent caught her attention, and she gingerly stepped forward inch by inch to take it from my palm. The moment was electric, charged with trust and apprehension. My heart hammered in my chest. She looked at me as if trying to decide whether my intentions were pure. Finally, she allowed me to reach over and clip the leash onto the worn collar I hadn't noticed until that moment. It was hidden under her matted fur, a simple black collar with no tags, but it served as a heartbreaking reminder that she once belonged to someone. Now, with the leash secure, I moved carefully to avoid spooking her. Tensed for a moment but didn't bolt. Over the next half hour, I coaxed her step by step until we were out of the alley and moving toward my car, which I'd parked discreetly nearby. She paused when she saw the car, ears flattening in fear, but desperation and fatigue won out, and she followed my gentle pulls on the leash. Getting her inside was a slow, careful process. She trembled uncontrollably, eyes wide with panic, but I kept murmuring soft reassurances. Finally, she settled on the back seat, still shaking but not trying to flee. My emotions churned. Part of me felt guilty, as though I were betraying her mission. But logic and compassion told me this was the right thing. She needed help, or she might die alone on those streets. I drove straight to a local veterinarian who had agreed to treat her after hearing her story. In the clinic, cowered in a corner, panting nervously, the vet approached slowly, speaking in soothing tones. After an initial exam, they confirmed her malnourishment, dehydration, an infection in her wounded leg, and the early signs of pneumonia. She was in dire need of rest and treatment. The vet administered antibiotics and fluids, cleaned her wounds, and gave her the first real meal she'd probably had in weeks, maybe even months. Watching swallow the food with shaky eagerness, I felt tears spill down my cheeks. I couldn't help imagining her confusion, her heartbreak that had driven her to walk those endless miles, day after day, searching for someone she would never find. Overnight, she stayed at the clinic. I visited her the next morning, finding her curled on a soft blanket in a large kennel, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. The vet told me she'd made it through the night, which was a victory in itself. But more time was needed to see if the infection and pneumonia would subside. I spent the day there, stroking her fur through the kennel's bars, whispering encouragement. She was still guarded, still afraid. Yet I saw a hint of relief in her eyes, as if part of her understood that, for once, she could rest without fear. It took nearly a week for it to stabilize. During that time, the story of the stray dog who walked 10 miles each day began to circulate widely, helped in part by my social media posts and the local news station picking it up. People were moved by the tale of unwavering devotion, and offers to adopt or foster began pouring in. But I turned them down for the time being. It felt like, and I had begun something together, an unspoken pact that I would care for her and do my best to honor the memory of the person she lost. Part of me also worried that placing her in a new home too soon, without letting her process her loss, might do more harm. I'm not sure how much dogs comprehend about death, but I knew her grief was real. When she was finally well enough to leave the clinic, I brought her to my apartment. At first, she was apprehensive about stepping inside. The moment the door closed behind her, she began to pace, nose pressed to the floor, as if searching for an escape route. Gently, I guided her to a soft bed I had set up in the corner of the living room. Over the next hours, she sniffed around, exploring the new territory, her limp now less severe thanks to proper treatment. I left the door to my small balcony open, so she could always sense she wasn't trapped. Slowly, very slowly, she settled enough to lie down and sleep. Those first nights would wake up trembling, sometimes letting out high-pitched whines that tore at my heart. I would kneel by her bed, softly rubbing her back until she calmed. It reminded me of comforting a frightened child. Despite everything, she was still searching, yearning for the person she had loved. The knowledge that they were gone, that her waiting had no reward, felt almost too cruel to bear. But life has a way of moving forward, even when burdened by grief. Days turned into weeks and health improved. She ate regularly, filled out a bit, and her coat, while still patchy, regained a subtle shine. She would follow me around the apartment, always at a slight distance, still a little wary. Yet each time I left for work, I'd catch her at the window, watching me go, ears pricked. And each time I came back, she'd greet me with a soft wag of her tail, as though uncertain she was allowed to be happy but grateful I returned. The question that haunted me was whether still felt the urge to revisit her old pilgrimage. Would she try to escape and walk those 10 miles again? Part of me feared that if I let her out of my sight, she would vanish, returning to those places of memory. Indeed, in the early days, she would stare at the front door for hours at a time, as though contemplating how to get out. Once, I tried taking her for a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to give her exercise and reassure her she wasn't confined. The moment we stepped outside, she pulled with surprising strength, attempting to drag me in the direction of Avenue. It was as though she remembered her route by heart. My chest tightened, but I held fast to the leash, calling her name, urging her to stop. Eventually, she did, but not before letting out a mournful whimper that echoed my own regret. Over time, with patience and gentle redirection, began to accept shorter walks that didn't lead to her old path. She'd still pause and look longingly in that direction, ears perked, nose twitching as if catching phantom scents. Yet she no longer fought me. I'd kneel beside her and stroke her fur, whispering that I was sorry for her loss, that it was okay to let go. I had no idea if she understood my words, but I hoped she sensed the empathy behind them. As she acclimated to indoor life, I continued my quest to fully piece together her past. I felt it was important to honor her memories and, in some way, bring closure if possible. Eventually, my determination paid off. A kind nurse at the hospital recognized from a photo I showed her. She recalled a patient named who had been severely injured in a car crash about a year ago. Had a dog she adored, but the dog had gone missing shortly after the accident. His family, devastated and overwhelmed, hadn't known where the dog disappeared to. Sadly, passed away a few weeks after being admitted, never regaining full consciousness. Tears blurred my vision as I listened. The nurse explained that had also been in the car and did not survive. The few relatives who remained were elderly or lived out of state. It seemed there was no one left to care for. The nurse had no further details, only that she remembered the heartbreak in the family's eyes over the missing dog. They'd put up flyers, posted online, but no one ever responded. Had presumably been wandering ever since, searching for or perhaps both. That night I sat beside on the living room floor, gently stroking her ears, my eyes burning with tears. At last, I understood the depth of her devotion, the reason she kept visiting those specific places. She had been retracing the life she shared with, unable to accept that her loved ones were gone. Dogs, it seems, can hold on to hope longer than any human could. In her mind, maybe still existed in all those places, and so she would keep walking, day after day, until she found her again. I began to speak softly, telling about the truth I'd uncovered. It might have been foolish. She was just a dog, after all, and my words were human language. But as I told her about how she was gone, about how I wished there was a way to bring her back, rested her head on my lap, eyes cloudy with a lingering sadness. Maybe in her own canine way, she understood the finality. I could feel her breathing slow, as though some tension deep inside was finally unwinding. That was the night fell into a deep sleep, one undisturbed by whines or tremors. I stayed up, keeping vigil, wanting her to know she wasn't alone in her sorrow. In the days that followed, his demeanor shifted. She still had moments of restlessness, staring at the door as if considering a final trek to those old places, but she also leaned into the new life I was offering. Her appetite returned with vigor. She began to wag her tail more often when I spoke to her. Occasionally, she would sniff my hand in a gesture of trust, even offer me a tentative lick. The transformation was subtle but profound. I realized that while she might never forget, she could learn that love and care still existed in the world, just in a different form. Despite her progress, his health had been compromised for a long time. The vet warned me that the pneumonia had weakened her lungs, and the infection in her leg had caused lasting damage to her joints. She might never run like other dogs, and she could have flare-ups of respiratory issues. But with the proper treatment, a good diet, and a warm place to rest, she could still enjoy life for years to come. I vowed to give her exactly that. Each morning, I woke up to her curled on her bed, her breathing softer, her eyes brightening when I greeted her. We would eat our breakfast, mine hurried, hers leisurely. Then I'd take her for a short walk around the block, letting her sniff the fresh morning air without straying too far. I made sure to pass by a small park with tall grass, just so she could indulge her senses. Although she still limped, she seemed to appreciate these gentle outings. Afterwards, I'd head to work, and when I returned in the evening, her tail would thump against the floor in a greeting that always melted my heart. Word spread about its new home, and people from the community began sending messages of support. Some offered to donate food or pay for vet bills. The caretaker from the yellow house dropped by with a bouquet of flowers one afternoon, tears in her eyes, to meet up close. She gently pet its head and whispered, "I'm so glad you found some peace, sweet girl." Even the old man from the bus stop, the one who remembered seeing with that young couple, visited once. He stood in my doorway, stroking her fur and nodding to himself, as if acknowledging the tragic but beautiful resolution. Yet for all the goodwill, a small part of me worried might never fully let go of her ritual. I kept the leash by the door, prepared for the day she might insist on leaving. That day came sooner than I expected. One crisp afternoon, she stood by the door and whined softly, her eyes searching mine with an urgency I couldn't refuse. My heart lurched. She wanted to visit those places again. Maybe she needed closure, so I prepared for the trek. The vet insisted I be careful not to stress her too much, given her health. We planned a shorter route, skipping the industrial zone and hospital. Instead, we would visit the rundown house with peeling paint and the yellow house with the oak tree, which were two of the most significant stops. I packed water, treats, and a warm blanket in case she needed rest. Then, I set out. Walking with her on that route felt surreal. It was like retracing a ghostly map of her memories, but this time she wasn't alone. When we reached the rundown house, approached the rickety porch steps and sniffed the door. No one answered, of course. The house was still empty, the mailbox still stuffed with unopened letters. Let out a soft whimper, then glanced back at me. I knelt beside her, ran my hand through the fur behind her ears and murmured, "It's okay. She's not here anymore." Didn't linger long. She backed away from the door and returned to my side, as if acknowledging that the past was truly gone. We continued to the yellow house. The caretaker had informed the owners of our visit, and they graciously allowed us onto the property. Limped her way straight to the oak tree, where she had once waited countless days for. She sniffed around the trunk, the grass, the low-hanging branches. Then she sat, gazing up at the leaves fluttering overhead. A breeze rustled the branches, sending a gentle shower of golden leaves swirling around us. It was a strangely beautiful moment, tinged with the quiet hush of acceptance. I'm not sure how long we stayed there. Time seemed to slow to a gentle trickle, as breathed in the scent of the place where she had once felt love and belonging. At some point, I sat down beside her, leaning against the gnarled bark. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dancing patterns on the ground. Rested her head on my lap, closing her eyes. It was as if she was saying her final goodbye. When at last we rose to leave, a subtle change had passed over her. She walked away from the oak tree without looking back, her limp steady but uncomplaining. The caretaker, who had watched from the porch, wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. As we passed, she crouched to Stroke's back and whispered, "Good girl." Gave a soft wag of her tail, a gesture of thanks, and then we were off, heading back toward my car. That evening, back in our little apartment, ate her dinner and curled up in her bed with a contented sigh. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, feeling the echoes of what I had witnessed. It was heartbreak and healing all at once. I realized how extraordinary's devotion had been, that unwavering faith that her loved ones might be found somewhere along those lonely roads. And I felt honored, humbled that I could guide her toward accepting that they were gone, yet her life could still continue, with new love and care to support her. Over the following months, settled fully into her new routine. The nightmares came less frequently, and her cough subsided. She gained weight, her fur grew thicker, and she even started playing, tentatively at first, nudging a squeaky toy or chasing a soft ball across the living room. We took slow walks through different neighborhoods, exploring new sights and scents, writing a fresh chapter in her life. People who recognized her from the viral story would occasionally stop us on the street, exclaiming, "That's the dog who walked so far every day." They'd marvel at how healthy and calm she looked now. For her part, would greet them politely, wagging her tail in a subdued but friendly manner. One morning, as I sat on the floor brushing out the last of her winter coat, I thought I saw a hint of a smile on her muzzle. Her eyes sparkled, and she leaned her head into my palm for more affection. In that moment, I sensed that she was letting go of the sorrow that had driven her for so long. She would never forget. Dogs remember love in a way we can only imagine, but she was embracing the life she had now. Yet, as life often does, there was one final twist of fate. A few weeks after that peaceful morning, I received a phone call from a woman named Rose. She introduced herself as cousin from out of state. She had seen the viral story and recognized Dog in the photos. With a trembling voice, Rose explained she had always wondered what became of. When died, Rose was willing to take in, but nobody knew the dog's whereabouts. Rose apologized for not finding her sooner. She had pressing family obligations and she didn't live nearby. But now she wanted to see if there was any chance the dog might remember her. My heart twisted. Part of me feared that Rose would want to take away, that I'd lose the companion I had come to cherish. But I also understood that Rose had every right to see the dog had once loved. So we arranged a meeting at my apartment. The day Rose arrived, was napping in her bed. I gently woke her, then opened the door. Rose stepped inside, eyes filling with tears at the sight of. She knelt down, arms open, calling his name softly. Lifted her head, ears perking at the familiar sound. For a brief moment, I saw recognition flicker in her eyes. She stood, limped toward Rose, and pressed her nose into Rose's outstretched hands. Rose broke down, hugging gently, tears streaming down her face. They spent the afternoon together, Rose telling stories of and how she'd adopted from a rescue as a puppy. She shared photos of laughing, bounding around the yard, a life brimming with warmth. I sat quietly, tears in my own eyes, witnessing this bittersweet reunion. It was as if in her own way, remembering a piece of her past, but without the desperate longing that had once propelled her daily trek. This time, her tail wagged calmly, her eyes soft. She nuzzled Rose affectionately but then returned to my side, resting her head against my knee. It was clear that she was glad to see someone connected to her past, but her home, now, was with me. Rose, seeing this, smiled sadly and stroked fur. "Thank you," she told me, her voice trembling. Thank you for giving her a home, for loving her the way would have wanted. I always thought I might take her in if she was found, but it seems she's already where she belongs. Would be so grateful to you. We talked for hours, sharing every detail of his journey, the heartbreak and the slow healing. Rose eventually left, promising to keep in touch. Watched her go with a calm acceptance, no whines or attempts to follow. That night, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over us. In a way, was there too in the stories and the memories, in the dog that once walked 10 miles every day to find her. Now, finally understood that love could persist even in the absence of the one she lost, that the bond they shared wasn't undone by death, but transformed into something else, something that lived on in memory and in the caring arms of new companions. In the end, the truth of story, the one that broke so many hearts, was also the truth of her unwavering spirit. She showed us that love endures beyond logic, beyond the borders we try to place between life and death. She reminded us that grief can be a journey measured not just in miles, but in the slow crawl toward acceptance. Her desperate pilgrimage may have started from heartbreak, yet it led her into the arms of those who would cherish her anew. Months turned into a full year. Limp remained, and her muzzle began to show flecks of white. But she moved with a quiet dignity, trusting the world a little more each day. On sunny afternoons, we sometimes sat on my small balcony, watching the world pass by. I'd stroke her fur, thinking of that first time I saw her on Avenue, the limping silhouette in the dawn light, the heartbreak in her eyes. If you had asked me then, I would have never guessed where our paths would lead. Yet here we were, two souls who found each other in a moment of shared need, forging a bond that forever changed us both. Sometimes I wondered if still remembered those roads, the houses, the hospital. Perhaps she did. Some memories, no matter how painful, remain etched in us forever. But she no longer carried them like a wound that refused to heal. Instead, they became part of her tapestry, a history that made her who she was. And in that acceptance, there was a gentle beauty, a sense of coming full circle. Even now, people who learn about Story can't help but be moved to tears. They share it with friends, post it on social media, draw lessons from the dog's indomitable devotion. I'm often asked, how can a dog love so deeply, so faithfully? I never have the perfect answer, but I suspect it's because dogs love their entire being. They don't hold back, they don't calculate risk, and when they attach their hearts to ours, they do so with the kind of unwavering loyalty most of us can only dream of. That is why walked 10 miles every day, through the bitter cold and scorching heat, risking everything in traffic and unforgiving streets. She believed in her heart that the person she loved was still out there, waiting. And though she never found in the physical sense, she found a new life, a new connection, and a new way to keep the memory of her old life alive. Her persistence was heartbreaking, yes, but it was also a testament to the very essence of love, love that crosses boundaries we can't even begin to articulate. In the quiet moments, as I watched doze by the window, soft snores escaping her muzzle, I find myself overcome by gratitude. I think about how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't decided to follow that limping shape in the early dawn, if I had simply boarded the bus and looked away. That choice, seemingly small, altered both our lives irrevocably. It reminds me how a single act of compassion can ripple outward in unimaginable ways, changing fates and mending broken hearts, both human and animal. And so, to anyone reading or hearing this story, I offer this final thought. Sometimes, the simplest acts, like pausing to notice a stray dog limping down a deserted street, can unravel the most extraordinary tales of devotion and heartbreak. Sometimes, all it takes is a moment of empathy to transform tragedy into hope. This journey may have begun in sorrow, but it ended in a place of love and safety. That transformation, in its own quiet way, was nothing short of miraculous. And though this story may break your heart, I hope it also heals a part of you, reminding you that even in the face of loss, love remains the most powerful force we have.